In terms of shooting with that big camera, there's a lot of a sense of making.
Andrea Modica lives in Philadelphia and is professor of photography at Drexel University. She received a BFA in visual arts and art history from State University of New York College at Purchase, followed by an MFA at Yale University School of Art. Her photographs have been featured in many magazines, including the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Newsweek, and American Photo. Modica has exhibited extensively and has had solo exhibitions at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Cleveland Museum of Art, and San Diego Museum of Photographic Arts. Currently, you can view her work at the Saginaw Art Museum as part of the exhibition Field of Vision. Listen in to learn more about Modica's process of using an 8x10 camera to produce her photographs. Andrea, welcome to the Temple Arts Podcast. It is so good to have you on here. We appreciate having your work in our current exhibition, Field of Vision. I want to jump right in and learn more about the way that you're making your photographs. There is a lot of photography that has gone digital in these modern times, but you're still using a little bit different process. Can you describe your camera and the equipment that you're using and the process that you go through for making your work?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. I use an 8x10 camera, which is a relatively large camera. If you could imagine a 35 millimeter camera the size of that piece of film, an 8x10 camera needs to accommodate an 8x10 inch sheet film. And the photograph is set up, and there's a lot of options with that camera in terms of the lens plane and the back plane, that you can change the relationship of the two and affect the way the image looks while taking the picture in camera, so not Photoshop. And these two images in the show are very much affected by that. So if we could just put that aside for a moment, maybe get back to it. So the camera is set up. The aperture is all the way open, so the photographer can see through a ground glass upside down, and under a dark cloth. And the image is then the photographer will tweak, maybe moving closer, move farther away, move to the left, move to the right, move up and down, but also move these standards in relationship to each other, the lens and the film plane. So all of this drawing can be done, as I said, in the camera. So at that point, then the lens needs to be shut down. So the aperture is where you want it, if you want great depth of field or not great depth of field. Shutter speed needs to be adjusted according to a light meter. A film a holder needs to be put in the back. Oh, must remember to close the aperture, close the lens. Film holder put in the back, and a slide taken out. And then the picture is made, the slide is put back in, indicating that that piece of film has been exposed. And there is another piece of film on the other side. You might take a second exposure of the same thing, or move the camera to a new place and take a whole new picture. So
So,
these photographs are very, very much a product of having moved the standards front and back. And I could be very specific about how that's done.
yeah, the process that you just described is much different than perhaps the way that photographers or hobbyists work nowadays, where it's a little more point and shoot. Tell me more about sort of the process that you go through in making some of those decisions about setting up your camera and what to point your camera out, what to point your camera at, given the amount of effort that it takes to create an exposure. What kind of decision making is there before you maybe even go into the field?
I work very intuitively. I know many photographers are much more conceptually based, and I think in the end, my work is conceptual. But the act of working, of photographing, is very, very intuitive. So if I feel I want to be with a subject, that's where I go. And often I will go someplace where I'm uncomfortable. And I'm kind of coming to terms with that subject through the act of photographing. But this project, these two photographs in the show are really not about that. This was instead a commission through Graphic Studio, the wonderful organization in Tampa, Florida. Uh, and they had me there to photograph the Florida landscape. And so I spent some weeks traveling around Florida and making pictures and getting to know that landscape pretty intimately in the summer, I want to point out. So it was quite warm. And then my 8x10 negatives, which I process, were transformed into plates for printing in ink. So the images in the show are actually photogravures. So they are they are photographs in a sense, but they are not made with light sensitive material. They're made with ink put into a plate, which was light sensitized and exposed with the negative and burnt with some kind of chemical, perhaps some kind of acid, just as an etching and drawing would be made. So they are photogravure, and I did not make the final prints. I made the photographs and processed the film. And I typically, with my own work, print in platinum, which is a non-silver 19th century hand-coated process. So that's one of the reasons why I use the large format camera, so I can produce this big negative. But and I'm going off your question here, Thor. Is that okay?
Oh, that's okay.
Okay. I'm moving far away from your question. But in terms of shooting with that big camera, there's a lot of a sense of making of the image. So you're carrying around the camera when I photograph people, which is really what I do primarily, or I had done for many, many years primarily. There's a collaboration going on. There is a response to the camera. So the world reacts differently to the camera. You react differently to the world with this camera. But okay, this is a landscape. So it's not reacting to me. And there is this sense of kind of punching your hands into clay and making something when a camera like this is used. For one thing, it makes the practitioner slow down. It's heavy, back-breakingly heavy. It is expensive, involves chemistry, which is not good for you. There are all kinds of sacrifices. There's got to be a good reason. So if you don't love the act of making the picture with the big camera, then it makes absolutely no sense. But it does permit me to produce these platinum prints, which are really quite luminous and very seductive. And that is a device that I use really to pull viewers in. It's also just something I love to do, is make beautiful objects. But very often I'm photographing a subject that is not quite so pleasant and kind of giving it this veneer and seductive quality with this beautiful print. So all that is tied into the big camera. We at Drexel, where I teach, we still have our students study the 4x5 camera. It's not as big as the 8x10, but it's still a large format camera, because we find that this requires them to slow down. And then when they go to digital or go back to digital, they've learned to see more with more decision. They're making more decisions and not, as you say, Thor, pointing and shooting. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, that sense of making that you described, in so many ways, it seems like digital photography has taken some of that process away, whereas what you're doing involves, as you described, sort of your whole self in terms of using your person and to make these photographs, and not just your vision in your mind or your eye to see them, but very much a way of making a tangible object, and translating what you do see into that tangible object. With that in mind, moving back a little bit to the series you did on Florida landscapes. When I think of Florida anyway, I generally think of sunshine and beaches, and it's all in color. And in this case, these are monochrome. What was that like to be photographing Florida, sort of outside of having those elements of color? I'm a little curious about your experience there.
I have been a black and white photographer since the late 1970s, so I never really asked myself that question. I'm sent to photograph, and I'm sent to make my pictures, and my pictures are in black and white. So I never really thought that through. I do love the color scheme of much of Florida. I'm a real mid-century fan in terms of design, clothing, furniture, architecture, and there's lots of great stuff in Florida. But I didn't feel as if I had to record that necessarily. I was making something new, which was
Mhm.
my work of that place.
Yeah, it's almost as though you're making a translation of your vision, and it doesn't require that color for it to be your vision. In some ways, the color would have been distracting in these pictures if it were present, right?
Well, a great color photographer would have made great color pictures, but I am not a great color photographer. So it's like asking me truly, why aren't these drawings or paintings or sculptures? It's just it's a completely different medium
Huh.
to me,
Yeah.
my experience. Mm.
Well, looking at some of the other landscape work that you've done, that you have posted anyway, there is a particular um, emptiness or eeriness about some of those images. Can you talk a little bit more about some of your other landscape work?
It's hard to discuss something that we're not pointing to and looking at. I have a lot of landscapes with, oh goodness, animals in them. The animals are often still, sometimes dead. I worked for 9 years at a slaughterhouse, for example. So part of that is my interest in looking closely at these things that might not seem that pleasant, but also it just the logistics of using a large format camera and what is possible. As I already described, is a slow process. And by the way, the exposures are quite slow. So the whatever the subject is needs to stay still. In many ways, a landscape is easier in that regard for me. Doesn't mean it's easier to make great pictures. Absolutely not. But at least, landscape's not gonna get up and walk away.
Yeah. Yeah, the difference between photographing my children and photographing a tree is is a completely different exercise.
Yes, yes, yes. Mhm.
And what do you find most rewarding in the process of making the photographs? You mentioned some of this sense of making. What do you feel like in the process of creating the photographs brings you the most reward?
Hmm, that's a great question. Right now, I just wrote about this last night for another interview. The greatest reward is the sense of discovery that photography not just permits, but encourages, and in fact, probably demands. So, especially if you're being sent someplace that you've never been, it's an incredibly challenging thing, but also a tremendous privilege. For instance, I photographed inside an operating room for the New York Times Magazine. I wouldn't have had access to that operating room. Is that a place I really want to hang out? I didn't really think so, but I found it fascinating, and I understood more about medicine and about my own fears about going into an operating room, which I think we all share. And that actually led to a much larger 8-year body of work. So photography puts me into situations that I wouldn't be in without the camera. And it also, permits people to open up more, it seems to me, than they would without the camera. So in the end, there's an intimacy that in my life doesn't exist with strangers, for example, without the act of photographing. And that would certainly pertain to the landscape as well. There's a, kind of investigation of being in that space, which doesn't exist without the camera, not for me. So the act of making pictures is an act of discovery. Sometimes those things are good, sometimes the things are not so good, as in scary. But in any case, that discovery gives us more of a life to choose from, and a greater life, a better life, I would argue. So that's the most rewarding. Does that make sense? So just having spent that time in Florida, for example, I've been to Florida many times. I went with my family as a kid for vacation. It was not quite the same as walking around alone with an 8x10 camera and making photographs. Very, very, very different. And it's a privilege.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your story and a little bit more about the work that you're doing, both the process and it's just fascinating to learn the way that you work and hear a little bit more about your perspective on making photographs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Saginaw Art Museum's current exhibition Field of Vision will be on display through February 24th, 2023, and is supported by Hemlock Semiconductor, Shaheen Development, Morley Companies, and the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. The exhibition was organized by the Flint Institute of Arts in Flint, Michigan. Thank you for listening to the Temple Arts Podcast. Please consider subscribing to the podcast and making a donation to the arts through SaginawArtMuseum.org or TempleTheater.com. This will allow us to continue bringing enriching programs to Saginaw and beyond.